everyone, and welcome. I'm Julie Mashak, Director of Global Programs in 92Y's Belfer Center for Innovation and Social Impact. We're so happy to have you join us for tonight's discussion of the new and incredibly timely documentary, All In, The Fight for Democracy. Please note, we are taking questions from the audience this evening. We know people are joining us on a variety of devices, but wherever you're watching, simply put your questions in the comment section and they will get to us. This evening's event is part of 92nd Street Y's Campaign for 100%, a new series of deep dive conversations about what changes when more people vote and how we ensure that everyone can participate in democracy. Please go to 92y.org/campaign for 100% to learn more. And you can also register for all of the other free events in this series. But first, please join me now in welcoming tonight's moderator, Annette Insdorf. She is Columbia University film professor and moderator of 92Y's Real Pieces series.
Hello, everyone. I'm Annette Insdorf, Columbia University film professor, and fortunate to be the Real Pieces moderator at 92Y. Tomorrow is National Voter Registration Day. That makes tonight's discussion and the film, All In, The Fight for Democracy, even more timely. I hope you've all watched this powerful documentary, which had its global launch on Prime Video September 18th. Amazon Studios also released it in select theaters on September 9th. It features Stacey Abrams, the first Black woman to become the gubernatorial nominee for a major party in the United States. The film's focus is voter suppression, a dangerous obstacle to democracy and a constant menace in the United States. All In presents examples from 2018, cautionary tales about voting, whether terribly long lines, broken machines, or voters turned away from the polls, including Abrams herself, for dubious reasons. This film also faces our history, which my own background tonight acknowledges with a photo from the 2020 calendar, A History of Racial Injustice. It shows African-American citizens in Alabama waiting in line to register to vote after the enactment of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And here's the trailer for All In, The Fight for Democracy.
If the power of the right to vote was truly made available to everyone in America, it would change the future of this nation.
Ladies and gentlemen, Stacey Abrams!
When I started running for governor, we anticipated that voter suppression was going to be instrumental in Brian Kemp's campaign, and we were right.
We've been in line for 5 hours.
They said, "You've already voted." Looks like several days ago. No, I would have remembered that.
Thousands of people were told no and didn't have the authority to demand better.
These lines are insane. We had precinct consolidation, non-training of local election officials.
I knew something had gone horribly wrong. The system that is supposed to protect our democracy didn't work the way it was supposed to.
States implement voter suppression laws all across the country.
Things like new voter ID laws, purging. You're knocked off the roll. Gerrymandering.
Changing the voting boundaries.
Ohio is a use it or lose it state.
In the United States, the right to vote is the only right you can lose simply for not using it.
Jim Crow 2.0, that's what we're saying. We've got a lot of work to do.
When we started as a country,
6% of people were eligible to vote. There are still forces that are determined to keep citizens from voting.
Unless we fight for the right to vote, our democracy is put at risk.
The fight over voting rights is ultimately about power.
The states have figured out how to stop African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, the young, and the poor from voting.
history is never a straight line. It's always a fight.
I will not concede because the erosion of our democracy is not right.
We try to make history.
The vote matters.
You belong. You have value.
Makes me want to see the film all over again.
Do it.
It is an honor. It is an honor to welcome the two directors of All In: The Fight for Democracy, especially because I've been admiring their work for a long time. Liz Garbus is the Oscar-nominated director of documentaries, including What Happened, Miss Simone, about blues singer Nina Simone, Love, Marilyn, that uses Marilyn Monroe's diaries as a point of departure, Bobby Fischer, Against the World, about the chess genius who gradually succumbed to paranoid delusions, The Farm, Angola, USA, The Fourth Estate, nominated for an Emmy in 2018, and the recent HBO series I'll Be Gone in the Dark. Her feature fiction debut, Lost Girls, premiered at Sundance and was released in March. Lisa Cortés was exec producer of the film Precious in 2009, nominated for 6 Academy Awards and winner for Best Screenplay, Jeffrey Fletcher, as well as Best Supporting Actress for Monique. I loved the documentary that she produced for HBO, The Apollo, about the legendary Harlem Theater, and I just learned that it won an Emmy for Outstanding Documentary and Nonfiction Special. She started out as a music executive at the Def Jam label and Rush Artist Management. She was also VP of A&R at Mercury Records and founded the Loose Cannon label. That gives her a solid basis for co-directing another new documentary, which is currently visible on Netflix, The Remix, Hip Hop X Fashion. So welcome to both of you. And I'm going to start off with some questions before we take a few from our audience. How did you co-direct? I'm always fascinated by a film that is made by more than one director, whether it's the Coen brothers or Garbus and Cortés. Was it that some of you directed certain segments, or that one of you directed a segment that the other one would then edit or revise? How did it work?
Shall I start, Lisa? Do you want me to?
You start and then pass the mic.
Yeah, well, you can see that kind of collaboration just in our consideration of one another about answering a question. I think that part of the challenge with this film was how much ground we had to cover. We started working with Stacey the end of last summer. And we had a really big story to tell that we knew we wanted to come out right about now, right? And we're, as you say, we're on the eve of National Voter Registration Day, and certainly wanted the film to remind people of the struggle that led to their having this right to vote. And so Lisa and I, Lisa did some of the interviews. I did some of the interviews. Lisa would work, we had 2 editors. Lisa would work with one of the editors on a certain section. I would work with the other editor on another section, and then we would bring it together, that, we would interweave them. And then, finally everything would end up with one editor. And then it was a collaboration and a back and forth. And I think Lisa and I were just very focused on getting this done, and getting it done, and being excellent. And so it wasn't about ego, it wasn't about it was just like we both did different things at different times, and we were in lock sync in terms of our point of view on the story.
Right.
Yeah, I would like to say, we put our hip boots on, and the advent of COVID, definitely was an interesting factor in the process of making this film, but in many ways it helped us with our divide and conquer approach, because there was, hundreds of years that we were looking to condense in a way that really meant that, I'd work on, from Reconstruction to the VRA, and then Liz would be working on, up to Shelby, and then we'd be looking at Wisconsin and figuring out how we were going to incorporate what was happening there in the spring into the film. So it definitely was a hive mind, and in a very fast moving creative process.
Well, one of the things that struck me is how you interweave the struggle for women to vote. At what point did that become a primary focus for the film?
Well, I think there are, when we look at our history, there's seminal moments. There's the inception of our country. Well, first of all, there's We the People, and which sets up in many ways the fallacies of that statement. And then we fast forward to the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, and then the 19th, which is granting enfranchisement to women, but it's unfortunately not extended to African American women. So as we created the architecture of the film, we saw that certain amendments spoke historically to beats that had contemporary resonance to the overall thesis of the film.
Right. And I noticed that among the archives you utilized, USC Hefner Archive. Hugh Hefner, forgive me, but I did want to ask about that and in general about how much research you did. But how did you discover the Hefner Archive and what did it provide?
Well, I know at least one clip that came from the archive. I mean, from my perspective as a director, and Lisa perhaps was more hands-on in the archival process than I was, but I'm generally we're asking for scenes and stories and moments in time, and then we have an archival producer who's calling up the archival houses. I know that one very, very special clip that came from the Hefner Library is one of my favorite in the film, which is at the voter registration office in 66, 65, I think, before the Voting Rights Act, where a little boy who is carrying a flag is an African-American boy with a mother or a grandmother or an older woman with him. And they are harassing them as they're coming down the courthouse steps. And this cop actually picks up this flag that this little boy is holding, 5 or 6 years old. And the boy is holding on to the flag so hard that he lifts up the boy who's just holding the flag. I seem to be very badly centered in this frame. And I know as I'm talking, I don't know if whoever's running tech on this can center me, because I'm not able to. But and that clip I had never seen before. I mean, there are these clips that in documentaries that talk about the civil rights movement that are iconic and that we, are kind of touch points. The Edmund Pettus Bridge, for example, never ceases to be extraordinarily powerful, jaw-dropping awe at the men and women walking across that bridge. But we've seen it, right? There were clips we found at that Hefner Library, like that little boy, that were very special.
Yeah, we really sought to do a very deep dive in it to try to find, the testimonials of the people at the beginning of the civil rights movement. Like, people had not really seen those before, because I think there's a tendency when you are looking at a particular period and there's been other films on the civil rights movement, you don't want people to tune out because they're like, oh, there comes that footage again. And so there was a very concerted effort with our archival producer to go to obscure sources for those scenes.
Sure.
And and also one of the things we wanted to create was the feeling a bit of, archival verite. I mean, we could interview folks today in Florida, for instance, who are returning citizens fighting for their franchise back after they've served their time. But, what about folks in the 60s or in the 40s, who were fighting for the franchise? So we also wanted to create the experience of, live history, as opposed to a narrator and looking at clips and that was, certainly one of the approaches of the film.
Well, I was also aware that from the beginning, you've got very quick cutting. Now, is that more for the sense of urgency or to pack in as much material as possible within a feature-length movie?
Well, there's the drama of setting up the stakes of 2018, because then we kind of could do a very quick pivot into history. And you know, a lot of people knew about Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial run, but for those who didn't, it was important to set up what was happening there, and then as a jump off to the historical precedents that, you know, are the employed different tactics, but for the same ends.
Okay. I also was struck by how up to date this documentary is, with Wisconsin citizens voting during the pandemic, George Floyd's brother exhorting people to vote, Black Lives Matter protests, and 8-hour lines at the June 20th primary. So my question is that, considering you were editing up until the last minute, is All In finished, or is this a film that you could update periodically?
You know, I think that I think All In is finished. Of course, you could update it, but I think we should update it when we get a new VRA signed, when we have a Democratic Senate. I think that since Shelby County in 2013, which, if you haven't seen in a film, is the Supreme Court case, which really took the heart out, or took, you know, the enforcement out of the Voting Rights Act, and really enabled the kind of voter suppression tactics we see today. Until that's changed, the film is complete, because these voter suppression tactics, whether it's 8-hour lines because poll places are understaffed or have faulty equipment, or because they've closed polling places in, you know, generally Black and brown communities to consolidate them, people all in one place, really to discourage turnout. You know, those stories, yes, we have the pandemic on top of it, but the story is really the same, you know? So it's like, you know, Wisconsin could pass a law next month, or there could be a court, but it's really the same story. So it's a story about power finding new ways to retain its hold, despite in many, many states being, you know, a minority party. And by minority, I mean fewer people, as opposed to, I'm not talking about race.
Right. Okay. I was noticing that most of your interview subjects sit behind this long table. Eric Foner, Carol Anderson, Ari Berman. Why this angle?
You're the first one who's asked that question. But
Yeah.
Go ahead, Lisa.
We're going to let the cat out of the bag, Liz. Should we have the great reveal?
Well, here's the deal. Those were green screen interviews. Okay, I don't know if you knew that by looking at them, but those backgrounds were comped in later, the rooms that they were in. And at the outset of this project, we explored working with artists who explore various themes in civil rights and civil rights movement, modern artists, as complements for our interviewees. And we wanted to create depth with that table. We ultimately found that the art was so complex and rich that in trying to absorb it behind an interviewee, that wasn't ideal. So we ended up incorporating art, for instance, in our animation, and we've been incorporating it in our campaign. But that has something to do. But in any case, the table is still useful to have to have a physical object within a space, which is actually a mirage.
You are the first person to ask us, and
so that's a scoop.
Yeah, nobody knew before that it was green screen.
Okay, I'm learning all the time, but it's true that in my classes at Columbia, I'm constantly exhorting the students to pay incredibly close attention to what's in the frame and what's left out of the frame, of course. But you know, when you talk about a documentary, for me, it's no different ultimately than talking about a fiction film, and I'm sure both of you are very aware of that because you've worked in both media. You have to not only capture elements and tell a powerful story, you have to find the correct or the appropriate visual language so that there's coherence throughout and that it builds. And I think that you have succeeded beautifully in doing that.
Well, an interesting story is when we shot plates to place behind everyone. And we chose a variety of spaces. They were industrial, there were libraries, there were lofts that had, a panoramic view of the city behind. And then Liz and I created this chart with pictures to figure out who was best in each setting. So it is quite intentional. Where you see Andrew Young, which is from the Brooklyn Library, and also for Stacey Abrams, who's in another kind of scholarly looking setting at the library. And then where you see Hans von Spakovsky from the Heritage Foundation in a much more colder, austere setting. So I think your comments about the framing, giving you kind of insight into the characters, this definitely was part of the process.
Good.
But in our defense, Hans von Spakovsky is not the only person who's in a loft sort of bare setting. So is, for instance, Stacey's campaign manager, Lauren Grow-Argo, or, David Pepper from the Ohio Democratic Party. So it wasn't that we were, putting folks in spaces to, shape your opinion about them, but there were aesthetic qualities that were complementary to their stories.
Right. And I did feel always a coherence despite so much disparate visual material from past and present, photographic and interview. And it all felt really, and despite the fact that there are two directors, really integrated in a beautiful way. We're going to also be taking a few questions that are coming in from Facebook, for example. One that came in is, what challenges did making a documentary about such a current topic pose for you?
Well, I think we always looked at how the past is prologue to this moment. And for those who've had the opportunity to see the film, what is important for us with this narrative is the connective tissue between the current topic, let's say the examination of the passage of Amendment 4 in Florida, which allowed for returning citizens to be able to regain their ability to vote. But we then take that current topic and tie it to the felony laws in Florida from 1868, which basically took away the right to vote for any felons or returning citizens. So the past and the present, are kind of like our two trains running.
Right. A question that just came in that I'm touched by and I want to share with you. Someone asked, any thoughts on how the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg impacts voting rights?
Well, obviously her passing impacts a lot. RBG wrote the brilliant dissent in the Shelby County versus Holder case that we were referencing earlier in this conversation. That case took the, really decimated the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that really told states with a history of racial discrimination in their voting laws that if they were going to change their laws, they had to run through the federal government to check if they were going to discriminate against any Americans. And so that essentially they could not pass racial discriminatory voting restrictions, racially discriminatory voting restrictions. So Barack Obama is elected in 2008, and various states which had been challenging the Voting Rights Act since the day it was passed in 1965. We're like, well, look, this is our greatest example that, we're in a post-racist America. We have an African-American president. What do we need this Voting Rights Act for? It's an infringement on states' rights. And, Ginsburg and, ultimately Shelby County, this case, Alabama, they were successful in winning this case and taking the that pre-clearance aspect of the Voting Rights Act, getting it gutted. Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote a brilliant line, which I hope I don't butcher right now, which is, just because you're using your umbrella in the rainstorm and you're not getting wet doesn't mean it's not raining, right? And the metaphor, of course, for, if I butchered it enough that the meaning is not clear, is that, the Voting Rights Act was that umbrella, and it was keeping you dry. And just because you're dry doesn't mean it's not raining, which was a brilliant dissent. Unfortunately, it was the dissent, and the case prevailed. But in terms of what it means for voting rights today, there is a Voting Rights Act on Mitch McConnell's desk, a Voting Rights Act that has been rewritten to deal with the issues that the Supreme Court pointed out in that 2013 case, and he is not bringing it to the floor for a vote, quite obviously. If we have a Democratic Senate in 2021 seated, then that majority leader, a Democrat, would likely bring that Voting Rights Act to the floor. It could then be challenged again and brought to the Supreme Court. And without RBG, it's a court that is very inhospitable to voting rights. The guise of their antagonism to the Voting Rights Act is states' rights, that you cannot have the federal government in control of state laws like this. But, in Bush v. Gore in 2000, state rights didn't seem to prevail, right? They overruled the decisions of the Florida state legislature. So, in fact, states' rights is also a fallacious argument, because really a lot of these conservatives just have it out for the Voting Rights Act because it enables more people, more Black and brown and poor and young and indigenous people to vote, who are citizens.
Right. No, I think all of us tonight are painfully aware of the passage of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I actually, even this past weekend, I was attending online Rosh Hashanah services with Central Synagogue, and one of the rabbis was quoting Ruth Bader Ginsburg to acknowledge her passing. And what he said was almost like a line lifted from your film, because she apparently officiated at one of the first same-sex marriages. And when asked why she did so, she said, because the Constitution was imperfect. It was originally designed for the 6% whatever of white men who owned land, no one else. And now we have to work to keep that Constitution, a living thing, evolving. Mm-hmm. She said, and by officiating at this wedding, it is he used the word embracive act. I would have said embracing, but embracive. And she was asked what she meant by that word. And she said, it means not grudgingly accepting another and changing, but with open arms. Mm. And I found that so moving. And, it's something that could have been inside of your film as well. Mm-hmm. We have a question that came in. Anyone that you wanted to interview for the film but couldn't or didn't?
We wanted to interview Brian Kemp, but had no response. Chris Kobach, several conservative voices who are leading proponents of these oppressive tactics, and they declined or just didn't respond.
Okay. I was also wondering about the films or directors that might have inspired you, especially to make a film like this. I have behind me from Ava DuVernay's The 13th, The Constitution, actually, which we got at a premiere. I don't know if that might have been a film, or could you talk, either of you, a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, as you know, both Lisa and I have a long history of working on films that have the intersection of personal stories and social justice issues, from The Farm to The Apollo, to Precious in a whole different way, so we've been down in this space for some time. However, I do think that, I do think the 13th was an inspirational touch point for us. It was so effective in distilling a really complex argument. And one of the stories I've shared with Ava and I've shared, recently with Lisa is that, my daughter who, I made this film called The Farm, right? And it was about 6 inmates at Angola State Penitentiary. And it's, the film is set and we have this, voiceover about it's a former prison plantation. It's a former slave plantation turned prison farm. And these guys are out working the fields, 80% black with white men on horses and big guns. It's all in the images. You don't even have to say anything. And then I remember my daughter going to school and coming and having watched the 13th. And she came back and she was like, Mom, the prison industrial complex, like she just got it. And there was a way that, that film and its directness, right? Because I suppose mine had a more kind of lyrical, character-driven approach. And Ava's film, in its clarity and focus, I'm not comparing them. They're different. They're just different styles of filmmaking. But I do think it was extremely effective. And I think it was really effective also for young people trying to grasp a really, really complicated issue. And a lot of people, I think with voter suppression, they kind of think, oh, yeah, I know I've heard about voter suppression and, I think it exists, but they don't really understand how it functions. And Lisa and I really felt that, if you made a verite film, say, following voters in Georgia or following just like Stacey's campaign, it would be dramatic and exciting and you would feel those personal stories. But really what was necessary in this moment was to widen the lens and look at it over the course of 200 years and look at it from sea to shining sea. That it is not, it's not just a problem in the South. It's terrible in New York and New Hampshire too, right? Like there's all kinds of ways in which this is functioning. And I think for us, the style of this film was dictated by the necessities of this moment. Yeah.
I think also with voter suppression, we see how, the monster changes its face through time. And in this moment, a lot of people think that voter suppression is, one, not real. There's another school that feels like, it's just bureaucracy. And there was this need to pull back the mask and to connect through time how it resurfaces and asserts itself, but with the same intention.
Good. Yeah. One question came in. Can you talk more about what it was like to work with Stacey Abrams? After all, this formidable woman is like the engine of your film. A little bit about that?
Well, sure.
Well, as you saw, we both got really big smiles as you read the question. So, of course, Stacey is our North Star. And I think the origin story of this project is interesting. She met with several filmmakers last summer because she was looking for a bigger platform to tell this history and to make it a talking point for Americans, really to pull the curtain back. And she was, she didn't want this to be about like Stacey Abrams did not win in 2018. She was very explicit that it was not about, greater than her loss was that Georgians were denied this fundamental right. But of course, when, so she was like, I don't want to be centered in this film in any way. Because it's bigger than me. But of course, as filmmakers, Liz and I were like, well, she's the spine and allows us to pivot in and, have this emotional center that allows us to access these other moments. So when we shared the cut with her, the rough cut, we were very nervous because we had kind of, put a little bit more of her story in there than I think she expected. But to her credit, she put her producer hat on and trusted us as storytellers, but also saw how the incorporation of her story affected the historical journey that we took people on.
Good. Well, one of the most remarkable aspects of the documentary for me is connected to Stacey Abrams and to your choice of a slightly different form of filmmaking, animation. I love the sequence where you use animation for the guard who refuses young Stacey Abrams and her family entry to the governor's mansion when she's been invited as her high school valedictorian. Could you talk a bit, because it's not that typical for a documentary to include an animated sequence?
Well, there were a few sequences in the film which we felt were really emotionally important, for which there was very little visual archive or none. And as filmmakers, you have different ways as documentary filmmakers, you have different ways to attack that problem. One is talking heads and cutting back to the same still. Okay, that's boring. We're not going to do that. Another way are reenactments. But in this film, and as I mentioned earlier, we had been exploring collaborations with artists, and we were really kind of interested, what is art? It's about giving voice to a person. What is democracy? It's about hearing those voices. And there was an artist who we were really attracted to, Diana Ijeta, who, we felt like through her hand-drawn images, which we had seen on the cover of The New Yorker and in other places, was really able to convey something very powerful, humanistic, and emotional. So there were several sequences. I mean, we started off with a longer wish list of about 6, and then we had to cut them to 3 that we decided to animate along with Diana. And that is the sequence of Stacey, who is valedictorian, who is entitled to go to this party at the governor's mansion, being turned away at the door. What a metaphor that was. We could have shot the governor's mansion. We could have shot some guards standing there. But what we decided to do was make it about Stacey's point of view on that. The guard becomes really, really large in that moment, and Stacey becomes really, really small, and it's like, how did that feel? We also used animation for another sequence where Stacey talks about her grandmother, and her grandmother telling her with tremendous shame about her fear of going to vote right after the Voting Rights Act was passed, and not believing that power was really available to her, that she could go without violence against her body and vote. And then also the story of Maceo Snipes, who is a story, which is, exactly why her grandmother would have that fear. A story of a World War II veteran, African-American, coming back who is assassinated for voting in 1946, I believe. Yeah. So those were the sequences in which, again, there was very little archive, and we wanted the emotion of the story to come across, and Diana was the right woman to do it.
Great. I mean, I confess to you that many years ago, I was more of a purist. And when I watched documentaries, I always had trouble with reenactments. I still do today. Animation, it just struck me as being so out of left field. But I have completely changed my mind about that, not only because of your film. A year ago, Ask Dr. Ruth, about Dr. Ruth Westheimer, directed by Ryan White. There, too, I was quite surprised that in this portrait of a remarkable woman, there were animated sequences representing her childhood during the Holocaust, when she was forced to leave her parents. And I remember her saying, when I interviewed her at the Tribeca Film Festival, initially she was horrified by the idea of animation for her story. And then she thought it would be like a cartoon. And then she saw the film and realized how evocatively and realistically this animation made the viewers feel about her life. So it can be done if it's done well.
I think it has to be integrated and have a relationship to the look and the feel of the rest of the film, as opposed to just feeling like some element from outer space.
Right.
It's my opinion. Or,
On the other hand, I very much appreciated how, with the end credits, you have something completely different. Figures like Gloria Steinem and Dolores Huerta speaking directly to the camera with instructions about how to vote. Could you talk a bit about that epilogue?
Well, Liz and I were talking, and I think we had shared the film with some high school students when we were in the rough cut, and a lot of their questions were like, wow, I'm going to be able to vote, and what do I do? And I think it's a natural coda that we arrive at the end of the film is this call to action. And working with our impact producer, we came up with the most important things and almost like a mantra of what people could do. Because I think once you've demystified and we've identified the monster, we wanted to give people the tools to fight the monster.
Good. And actually, that leads me to a question. Could you talk a little bit more about your goals for All In, the Fight for Democracy? In other words, I gather there's an accompanying action plan to reach and educate voters across the United States. Tell us a little more about that.
Want me to jump in? Well, I think we always had from the inception of this project a 360 approach. It's about the movie, the movement, the message. And very early on, with Dan Kogan, we started working on the social impact campaign and website. Once again, to answer those lingering questions about individual rules for your state, because things vary from state to state, what you can do if you think you're a victim of, how you can, once again, fight the monster. And it's allinforvoting.com is the our site. We'll be releasing a curriculum for teachers shortly. We have buses that are traveling through the country that are not only hosting pop-up screenings, but also registering people to vote. And as a part of this engagement, we're really excited to share that for 24 hours tomorrow, the film will be available for free on Twitter, on Twitch, on YouTube, and most importantly, for me, the second time I think it's ever happened at Amazon, it will be in front of the paywall. You do not have to be a Prime member to access the film. And then at 7 o'clock tomorrow night Eastern Standard Time, Stacey Abrams, Liz, myself, will be hosting a Twitter watch party, and we'll be joined by Lin-Manuel Miranda.
None too shabby. Congratulations. And what a wonderful gift to be giving United States citizens on National Voter Registration Day. I can't imagine a better way to extend your film beyond its initial conception into this vast way of affecting people. I really appreciate that. I also had a question. Perhaps it's my personal thing. Liz, I knew who your father, I know who your father is, Martin Garbus. He is such an important figure in American history, a celebrated attorney, author, and First Amendment protector. And I can't help but wonder to what extent he was a shaping influence on your work, including a film like this.
Well, thank you for those nice words about him. And he, before he was a First Amendment lawyer, he was a civil rights lawyer. He worked at the ACLU, as did Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of course. And one of the early cases he had as a lawyer at the ACLU in the mid 1960s was a voting rights case. And that was the case of a woman named Henrietta Wright, who 20 days after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in Mississippi, went to the courthouse to register to vote. and she was wearing a black power button. And as she drove back to the diner where she and her husband ran, and they lived behind the diner. And as she's getting out of her car before she could make it inside, sheriff pulls up and throws her to the ground and arrests her and throws her into the car. What is she under arrest for? She asks. Well, as she's gone through a stop sign, or reckless driving, they say. She says, there's no stop signs between the courthouse and home. I drive this every day. Doesn't matter. So she's thrown in jail overnight. She's beaten, and she is in the next day sent to a mental institution. So this was a story my father told. It affected him greatly. And, as many people know, the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, but it took many, many, many years for folks to be able to vote without the threat of violence. Of course, it's not over, that struggle. But so for me, it was something that we talked about at the dinner table. Part of white privilege is being able to vote without obstruction, and to go vote and come back within 45 minutes. But from an early age, I knew that was privilege, not a right afforded to all Americans. So, I would say that when after the 2016 election, I was really interested in doing something on voting rights. I didn't know what it would be. And it wasn't until Stacey came to us that I was like, okay, that's it. It was really Stacey's idea, but it had been simmering because I do think that people have a vague idea about the fight, or I'll say white people. I mean, perhaps Black folks are more aware of the history, but a lot of white folks have the idea that, there have been problems, but it's really like case by case, and don't have a sense that it's really, voter suppression is a feature, not a bug of the system. And between gerrymandering and poll closures and a narrow set of ID laws, that it is quite intentional and widespread.
And Lisa, I mean, do you actually remember the first time that you voted, and how important has this whole question of voting easily and freely been to you?
The first time I voted was with my mother. I must have been 4 or 5. And it was a big deal. I was like, why are we putting on our Sunday clothes on a Tuesday? But my mother went to great lengths to explain to me what we were going to do, the sacrifices that had been made for us to be able to do this. And, I always remember when she took me into the booth and we talked about the candidates. Of course, it's all wah, wah, wah in my head, but she took her hand in mine and we pulled the lever together. And, it's a moment like that has stayed with me forever. Talking about it now, I'm transported back to that time. And, I saw her work, my grandfather's work, just people in my family who were always advocating for, if not our seat at the table, the ability to build our own house and have a seat at the table. So it was something that was a part of the conversation, but also the actions that they were taking around me all the time.
Okay. Thank you. Which leads to one of the questions I'm reading from the chat. Where do you see hope? Do you see hope?
Well, I think that the silver lining in all the misinformation that's coming from the administration and Twitter and in Facebook is this real about voting and this inflammatory language about voter fraud and people illegally voting, which really just is a phantasm. I mean, it's just not borne out by any facts, even by those appointed by the President Trump himself to study the problem, can't find the problem, right? So I think that the silver lining about all the trash that's coming out about it is that people are like, really? And They're asking about it, they're talking about it, and they're getting information. People are aware of early voting. People are aware of absentee or mail-in balloting during a pandemic. Because of this pandemic as well, people are researching their choices. I feel like people are more prepared and planning to vote, more so in this election than in any election that I've tracked and followed. Now, I didn't have a film release at that time, but you really hear the way people are talking about voting, that they're really educating themselves about their options. So that to me is hope. Because I would say so often, and this is something that Stacey said to us the first time we met her, is people show up at the polls, they're told, oh, sorry, you're not registered here. Or in Georgia, a lot of people were told they'd already voted absentee when they hadn't. They see it as, oh, I must have messed something up. I must not have sent in some form, or maybe when I moved, I didn't do this or that. But I think now with all the information coming out, people are armed with the right information. You can request a provisional ballot, check your voter registration. You can do it online. So this is, to me, what's hopeful, because I believe the numbers and the goodness is there. It just needs to be counted.
Great. Lisa, any addition to that?
Well, I see the hope in the changes that we saw in 2018, the midterms. And I see the hope with people who are protesting in the streets, but are equally talking about protesting and showing up at the ballot box. I think never before has this kind, in my lifetime, has this language been so much a part of the topics that you're hearing, from the broadest range of people. This awareness of what has happened and the need to make that plan and make certain that their vote is counted.
Yeah. And if I can add a personal PS, late last night, I watched on Showtime on demand a new documentary called Surge, which is also co-directed by two women, Hannah Rosenzweig and Wendy Sachs. Rosenzweig had been Hillary Clinton's personal videographer in 2008. And it's about the record number of first-time female candidates in 2018 who ran, won, and upended politics in the midterm elections. And it focuses on three congressional candidates, for me the most significant being Lauren Underwood in Illinois. Each of the three in Texas and Indiana, also, they tried to flip a deep red district to blue. And then Underwood became she became the youngest Black woman ever elected to Congress. And now, too, in this year, we're finding unprecedented numbers of female and Black, Indigenous, people of color candidates who are challenging incumbents whose seats are considered safe or were considered safe. Mm-hmm. So for me, I would extend the hope, into the larger canvas of what your film touches upon. So now one other question that came in, did you talk to John Lewis at all about this film? I don't know if your timing was such that you were able to, but.
No, we weren't able to.
Yeah. I mean, of course, Stacey knows him and reached out, but I think the timing, he was not doing a lot at that time that we were filming.
No, and you managed, obviously, by including Andrew Young and the Edmund Pettus Bridge, you evoked John Lewis in a most beautiful, respectful way. If I remember correctly, I first watched All In just after John Lewis died. And, it packed that much greater a wallop to have him in that picture. Now we have, I think there's one more question that I saw coming in. We have only a few minutes left. My goodness, I have so many more questions, but I'm just going to make one or two points that in reading the materials that you have alongside your film, I found so much that I wanted everyone out there to be aware of. I want to thank you, first of all, for collating information. For example, in your press materials, you have a line, "I am a student. Can I register to vote at my school address?" And I was shocked. I was shocked to read the next line. Yes, you have the right to register to vote at your school address, including a dorm room. So you're doing something that is so, dare I say, socially significant, above and beyond, obviously, the act of making a very fine film, you're using the film to extend into, frankly, illuminating our society, because so many of us have a lot of holes about the nature of voting, especially if we've been lucky like me and accustomed to having no problem voting. But hey, I have an ID card. There are a lot of people who don't. And your film makes us more aware of those people and how they must be protected, how we have to be agitating to some extent in order to make sure that they're protected. In the remaining few minutes, I just want to ask if you have any additional points that you'd like to make, knowing that tomorrow is National Voter Registration Day, knowing that your film is finding its way out into the world right now. A closing thought or two that we should be taking with us.
I will say, check your registration. Even if you think you're registered, even if you just voted, check it, okay? There are problems all over the place. And then the next thing I'll say is make a plan. What is your plan for voting? Are you gonna early vote? Are you mailing it in? Do you know where your polling place is? Have your plan organized. I guess, that's in the film, and that's really what I'd say is the kind of the key thing for right now is to check your registration and make your voting plan. Good.
Thank you. And Lisa?
What I've enjoyed about this film is that the history we tell is not spinach. It is the history that puts you on the edge of your seat. You will cheer at the triumphs and you will shudder at the horror of what we have gone through. And it is great for family viewing and conversation. It's free tomorrow. Well, actually for 24 hours. Share it with your friends and use it as a tool to help you figure out that plan that Liz mentioned and how you're going to mobilize, engage with other people in your community, and make certain that your vote is counted.
Thank you.
And I'll just add, if I may, because usually Lisa does, but I'm going to do it. If you don't know how to check your registration, if you're not sure where to get these resources, our website, allinforvoting.com, will set you up. You can register to be a poll worker on that site. You can check your registration. You can find your polling place. You can do all of that on allinforvoting.com.
Great. And I just read Anuradha McGee writes, I applaud you, ladies. We need to make voters more educated. And documentaries like yours make it good for stimulating the dialogue. And people are thanking you, by the way, for the inclusive voter registration resource documentary, et cetera. Two things. I just want to thank Liz. This is yet another film of yours that I'm so grateful to you for making. Lisa, I will admit I'm very proud of you because you were my student way back at Yale University in the old days. You've done me proud. We are very grateful, by the way, to the Campaign for 100%. This particular event is taking place not only within the context of 9-2Y, My Real Piece is Remote. I just finished a 4-week series on racial justice on film. But the Campaign for 100% is an outreach from the Y that is trying very, very hard to educate everyone out there so that nobody has the excuse of, I didn't know where to vote, how to vote, whatever. We can no longer hide behind flimsy things like that when you and others have provided such good information for us. So thank you, Liz. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Julie Meshach from Campaign for 100%, and all of you who joined us this evening for what for me is a remarkably insightful discussion by two formidable filmmakers. So this
Thank you, Annette.
Saying good night.
Thank you, Annette, for introducing me to so many incredible filmmakers and shaping my young mind to go down this path. I am eternally grateful to you.
Thank you. To both of you, and good night to all of you out there. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.